All right. We all saw it just the other night. Ridiculous comeback by the Pacers in MSG to take a commanding, not really a commanding just yet, but to take a 1-0 lead over New York. That fourth quarter performance, specifically by Aaron Nesmith, was off the chain. It was simply one of the greatest individual fourth quarter performances of all time. No debate. The way I reacted while watching it was really interesting because he hit a few threes and I'm like, okay, this is one of those things where a team is down and a certain player is able to knock down a couple of shots because of the adrenaline, but I didn't think it was going to turn into anything real. We see it happen all the time, right? Where a team is trailing by a pretty significant amount and a couple of guys hit some big shots and you're not thinking too much of it. And by the time you hit the third shot, I was like, okay, this could end up turning into something. And it ultimately did end up turning into something. Then Tyrese Haliburton gets set up for this ridiculous game-tying basket. Totally silenced the Knicks crowd. He's done that a ton of times so far throughout the course of not just this postseason, but this season as a whole. I think he is 11 for 12 on go-ahead or game-tying field goals in the last 2 minutes throughout the entirety of the season. And it got me thinking a bit, and I saw this conversation and debate happening a bit today. What is the ceiling for Tyrese Haliburton if the Pacers are able to win a championship? And I know that's a massive hypothetical because right now they're just up 1-0 in a conference final series, and there's a pretty long way to go. But I was thinking about Jalen Brunson, right? I think if Jalen Brunson is able to win a title out of this postseason, he's a top 5 player in the NBA. I think the same about Anthony Edwards, right? If Anthony Edwards wins a title this postseason, he is also a top 5 player in the NBA, if that ends up being the outcome for him and Minnesota. I think the same about SGA. If you don't already think that SGA is a top 5 player, then he solidifies himself as a top 5 player with a championship win. Tyrese Haliburton is a bit in question, right? He's the only guy out of these four where you're looking at him and you're like, not sure if we're ready to call him a top 5 guy just yet if he wins a title. Right. And it's interesting because he is also, like these other guys that I mentioned, the best player on his team. Right. But again, the difference between him and Anthony Edwards and SGA and Jalen Brunson, I'm not sure we'd be ready to call him a top 5 player if he wins a title. And I think a lot of it comes down to how we look at Tyrese Haliburton and how we perceive his game. Let's think about Chris Paul in his prime. Chris Paul was never a 20-plus point per game guy. Never. Pass first, traditional point guard who could also hit shots at a high level. And he was able to be looked at as a top 5 player at a certain point in time. Then we fast forward and we have a guy like Tyrese Haliburton, who isn't exactly the same as Chris Paul, but in theory, right, approaches the game in a very similar way. Pass first point guard. First things first, he's going to try to get his teammates set up, and he's also going to use that as a way to get himself set up for his own shots and his own looks. They're very similar in that sort of way. So why was Chris Paul able to be looked at with that playing style? Why was he able to be looked at as a top 5 player in the league during his prime, but we can't do that same thing with Tyrese Haliburton? A lot of it has come down to the fact that the definition of what a point guard is in today's game is completely different than what it was maybe 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago, a truer point guard like a Chris Paul would be looked at as a top 5 player in the league, right? If he was playing at a ridiculously high level. Can the same be said about a point guard like Tyrese Haliburton in the game today, where he is a true point guard? He is a pass first player. He's not really going to go over like that 18, 19 or 20 point per game mark too many times throughout the course of his career in the regular season. Can you still be a top 5 player with that particular stat line? If you're leading your team to wins, right? And hypothetically, if you're leading your team to championship wins, and that's your stat line, you're around 19, 20 points and 8 assists. So you're a true point guard in every sense of the word. Can we still look at you as a top 5 player in the NBA? Could that still happen with Tyrese Haliburton, even though his stat line isn't as impressive from a scoring perspective as a Brunson or an Anthony Edwards or as an SGA? Is there still a world where a true point guard, someone who's putting up 20 points and 8 or 9 or 10 assists, is there still a world that exists for that sort of player to be looked at as a top 5 player in the NBA? Just curious, because again, it's gotten tough because over the years, we've had guys like Damian Lillard, Stephen Curry, Russell Westbrook just come in and out of the league. James Harden at a point in time was playing the point guard position and is actually still doing it here with the Clippers. Brunson himself, right? We've had so many score first point guards come in, and that kind of came the definition of the point guard position. We're so used to seeing that. Then you get a guy like Haliburton, who's not putting up these ridiculous scoring numbers like these other guys. Is there still a world that exists where we can look at that sort of player as a top five guy in the NBA? Again, example. 2013, Chris Paul was a top five player, arguably top five player in the NBA, and never averaged over 20 points per game. Could that same thing happen with Tyrese Haliburton if he's able to lead this Pacers team to a championship? And again, that is a massive, massive hypothetical. Still a lot of ways to go in order for something like that to happen. But it's just a question that I wanted to pose, right? Is there still a world where a really true point guard with a true point guard stat line where the numbers from a scoring perspective aren't ridiculous? Is there still a world where he can be a top five player in this league? Is there still a world where a true point guard can be looked at in that sort of way? Because there are so many things playing in his favor, right? He's got the clutch moments. He's got the multiple deep playoff runs. Like, think about the fact that Tyrese Haliburton, every time he's been in the playoffs, he has been in the Eastern Conference Finals, right? Ridiculously deep playoff runs every time he's in the postseason. He's got so many things that are setting him up as a top five guy in the league. The question now for fans is, are we ready to accept a true point guard quite like him, where again, he's not putting up these ridiculous off the wall scoring numbers? Are we ready to accept that sort of player as a top five player in this league?